The air inside the courtroom changed the moment the marshals entered. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted in their seats. Rain streaked down the tall windows behind the jury box, turning the gray morning light pale and cold. Richard Holloway slowly removed his hand from my folder. The confidence on his face did not disappear completely, but it cracked around the edges. One of the marshals stepped beside me. His coat carried the sharp scent of wet wool and outside air. "Special Counsel Naomi Carter?" he asked. "Yes." He handed me a sealed document tube. Heavy stock paper. Federal seal across the cap. The deputy near the aisle lowered his radio without realizing it. Richard glanced toward the judge's empty bench. Then back at me. "What exactly is this?" he asked. His voice sounded tighter now. I slid the tube beneath my arm and finally pulled my folder free from the table. The bent corner stayed folded upward like a scar. "You will know soon enough," I said. That landed harder than I expected. Not because of the words. Because I did not raise my voice to say them. Across the room, Marcus Reed sat frozen beside his public defender. The chain between his cuffs rattled softly when he moved his hands. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes and a fading bruise near his collarbone that makeup could not fully hide. He kept staring at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle underwater. The older women in the gallery whispered behind folded programs. One man leaned farther into the aisle just to get a better look at the marshals. Courtrooms lived on routine. Everybody inside knew the rhythm. Who sat where? Who spoke first? Who carried authority? The second something broke that rhythm, people felt it in their bones. Richard adjusted his cufflinks. Gold. Square edges. Tiny scales of justice engraved into the metal. Expensive enough to pay somebody's rent for 3 months. "This is highly irregular," he said. The court was not informed of federal intervention. One marshal looked at him without blinking. "The court was informed at 6:14 this morning." Richard's jaw tightened. That meant someone had kept him out of the loop on purpose. Good. The courtroom doors opened again. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered with quick steps, black robe shifting behind her like dark water. Everyone stood at once. Wood benches groaned. Papers rustled. The judge's expression barely changed when she saw the marshals. That told me she already knew. But when her eyes landed on the evidence box with the damaged seal, something colder entered her face. She sat down slowly. "Be seated." Her voice cut clean through the room. Richard remained standing half a second too long before lowering himself into his chair. Small mistake. Nervous people always delayed by a fraction. I took the empty seat at lead counsel. Nobody tried stopping me this time. The leather creaked softly beneath me. Warm from Richard's hand. Judge Whitmore opened the morning docket. "Before this court proceeds," she said, "we will address an emergency motion filed at dawn under federal review authority." A ripple moved through the gallery. Somebody near the back muttered, "Federal." Richard leaned forward immediately. "Your Honor, the prosecution objects to any delay in these proceedings." "Sit down, Mr. Holloway." He stopped talking. The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses and looked directly at me. "Ms. Carter. Are you prepared to present your findings?" Every eye in the room shifted again. I could hear the heating vents humming overhead. Somewhere outside, a siren passed through the rain. I opened my folder carefully. Inside sat photographs, transfer logs, witness statements, and access records from the county evidence server. One page still smelled faintly of printer toner. Fresh. Rushed. Important. Richard saw the top sheet and lost color immediately. He recognized the document before anyone else did. That meant he already knew what was inside. The judge noticed too. Her fingers stopped turning pages. "Miss Carter," she said quietly, "how extensive is this investigation?" I looked once toward Marcus Reed. Then toward the torn evidence seal beside Richard's elbow. "Much larger than one trial," I answered. Nobody in the courtroom moved after that. Judge Whitmore lowered her glasses slowly. Nobody in the courtroom seemed willing to breathe too loudly anymore. The rain outside had turned heavier. Water streaked down the windows in crooked silver lines. Richard Holloway stayed very still beside the evidence boxes. Too still. His fingers rested flat against the table now, but the muscle near his jaw kept tightening. I slid the first photograph across the bench. "Exhibit transfer room. County storage level B," I said. The judge studied the image carefully. Timestamp in the corner. 3:37 in the morning. 2 days before Marcus Reed's arrest. The evidence seal on box 14 was intact in that photo. I placed down the second image. Same room. Same box. Same camera angle. But now the seal was broken. Richard shifted in his chair. Small movement. Barely visible. The jury noticed anyway. People always noticed confidence disappearing. Who accessed the room between those timestamps? Judge Whitmore asked. I opened another document. Printer ink still fresh along the edges. Only 2 approved entries, I answered. The lead investigator and the prosecution office. Richard finally spoke. This proves nothing. His voice came faster this time. Less polished. Evidence boxes are reopened constantly during active preparation. Not without documentation, I replied. I slid another page forward. Missing signatures. Blank authorization line. The courtroom clerk leaned closer from her station. Her nails stopped tapping the keyboard. Marcus Reed stared at the documents like he was afraid to blink and lose them. Beside him, his public defender looked almost sick. She whispered something under her breath and rubbed one hand against her forehead. I had seen that reaction before. The moment somebody realized they had walked into a courtroom already poisoned before trial even began. Judge Whitmore examined the broken seal photograph again. Mr. Holloway, she said quietly, why was chain of custody incomplete? Richard loosened his tie slightly. Just enough for me to notice. Your Honor, the prosecution had no knowledge of any clerical oversight. Clerical oversight. Interesting phrase. He was already reducing the damage before the truth even surfaced. One of the reporters near the gallery raised her phone lower beneath the bench. Recording now. Richard noticed too late. I opened the sealed tube the marshal had delivered earlier. Thick cream paper slid onto the table with a dry whisper. Federal authorization order. Multiple signatures. Department seal stamped deep into the page. The judge read the first paragraph silently. Then her expression changed. Not dramatic. Worse than dramatic. Controlled. This court has been placed under temporary federal observation effective immediately, she announced. The gallery erupted in whispers. Somebody dropped a pen. Marcus lifted his head sharply for the first time since I arrived. Richard stood halfway from his chair. This is outrageous. Judge Whitmore looked directly at him. Sit down. He obeyed this time immediately. That mattered. Powerful men delayed when they believed they still controlled the room. Fast obedience meant fear had entered already. I turned another page inside my folder. A building access log. Electronic key entries. The evidence room was accessed again at 11:22 the night before trial, I said. After official lockout. The courtroom lights hummed overhead. Nobody moved. By whom? The judge asked. I looked at Richard. He held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds before looking away. That answer was enough by itself. The access credentials belong to Senior Prosecutor Daniel Mercer, I said. Mr. Mercer resigned yesterday at 4:40 p.m. The silence afterward felt colder than the rain. Richard's face lost the last trace of color. Mercer had worked under him for 11 years. The prosecution table suddenly looked too large around him. Too exposed. Marcus Reed swallowed hard beside the defense table. His cuff chain rattled softly again. Tiny sound. But in that silence it echoed. Judge Whitmore folded her hands together. "Ms. Carter," she said carefully, "are you alleging misconduct in this prosecution?" "No, Your Honor," I answered. Richard looked up sharply at that. For 1 second, relief flashed across his face. Then I placed the final document onto the bench. Internal communication records. 37 pages. Names blacked out. Dates highlighted in red. I am alleging a coordinated pattern, I said. Nobody whispered after that. The word coordinated seemed to drain the air from the courtroom. Nobody whispered now. Even the reporters stopped typing for a second. Rain hammered harder against the windows behind the jury box. The sound rolled through the room like distant static. Richard Holloway stared at the communication record spread across the bench. His eyes moved quickly at first. Then slower. Then not at all. He recognized the names hidden beneath the black bars. I could tell by the way his throat tightened when he reached the third page. Judge Whitmore folded one hand over the documents. "How many cases are connected to this pattern?" she asked. I answered without looking down. "At least 9 active convictions under review. Possibly more." A low breath moved through the gallery. Somebody near the back muttered, "Jesus." Marcus Reed lowered his head into his hands for a moment. Not relief. Not yet. More like exhaustion finally finding somewhere to land. His public defender sat frozen beside him. Her yellow legal pad still remained blank except for one shaky sentence written across the center. Evidence tampering confirmed. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. The leather creaked beneath him. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "this investigation appears politically motivated." There it was. The first pivot. When facts failed, powerful men reached for doubt. Judge Whitmore did not respond immediately. She removed her glasses and cleaned one lens with a folded cloth from her robe pocket. Small movement. Deliberate movement. The kind judges used when anger needed somewhere controlled to go. "Federal observation orders are not issued over politics," she said at last. Richard's fingers tightened around his pen. "Then someone has grossly misunderstood normal prosecutorial procedure." "Did they also misunderstand missing evidence?" I asked. His eyes snapped toward me. Quick. Sharp. The courtroom clerk glanced up again from her keyboard. Every person in the room felt the tension now. Not loud tension. Worse. Quiet tension. The kind that sat heavy behind the ribs. I opened another section of the folder. More. Photographs. Different case numbers. Different defendants. Same damaged seals. Same missing signatures. Same late-night access entries. Richard saw the pattern before anyone else fully did. That was the problem with guilt. It recognized itself immediately. 3 defendants accepted plea deals after evidence reviews changed overnight, I said. One is serving 20 years. Marcus slowly lifted his head. His cuffs rattled softly again. Tiny metal sound. It seemed louder every time. Judge Whitmore scanned the photographs one by one. "Were all these cases handled by the same office?" she asked. "Yes." "And supervised by?" I did not answer immediately. Richard stopped breathing for half a second. "Senior Prosecutor Richard Holloway," I said quietly. The words settled over the courtroom like dust after a collapse. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked at Richard directly anymore. That was the strange thing about power. The room bent toward it while it lasted. Then suddenly people became afraid to touch it at all. Richard stood up again. This time too fast. His chair rolled backwards several inches. I will not sit here and allow my career to be smeared by speculation. Judge Whitmore's voice cut through him instantly. You will lower your voice in my courtroom. He stopped. The veins along his neck had darkened red. For the first time all morning, he looked his age. Tired eyes. Loose skin beneath the jaw. Sweat beginning to gather near his temples under the fluorescent lights. One reporter quietly slipped out the side door with her phone already pressed to her ear. News was moving now. Fast. The county prosecutor's office probably still had no idea the walls were splitting open upstairs. I watched Richard straighten his tie again. Third time in less than 15 minutes. His composure was bleeding away in layers. Who authorized this investigation? He asked me. The Department of Justice. No, he shook his head once. Who brought them here? I looked at the evidence box beside his elbow. The torn seal fluttered slightly again beneath the air vent. Such a small thing. Paper lifting in cold air. But entire careers were beginning to collapse around that little tear. Someone inside your office, I answered. Richard went completely still after that. Judge Whitmore noticed it too. Richard Holloway did not sit back down immediately. He stood beside the prosecution table with one hand pressed against the polished wood, breathing carefully through his nose like a man trying not to lose control in public. The fluorescent lights above him seemed harsher now. Every line on his face showed deeper than before. Judge Whitmore watched him without expression. Mr. Holloway, she said quietly, do you wish to respond to the allegation that someone inside your office initiated federal contact? Richard finally lowered himself into his chair. Slow this time. Measured. I would like to see the source of these accusations. You will, I answered. At the appropriate stage. His eyes lifted toward me again. Cold now. Not shocked anymore. Calculating. That worried me more. Men like Richard survived for decades because they knew how to recover after impact. The courtroom air felt warmer suddenly. Too many people packed into one room. Wet coats. Damp paper. Coffee breath. Somebody near the jury rail quietly loosened their collar. I opened another section inside the folder and removed a thin gray envelope. No markings outside. Just a courthouse intake stamp from 3 weeks earlier. Judge Whitmore noticed the date immediately. This began before the Reed trial, she said. Yes. Richard leaned forward. What is in the envelope? I slid out a folded photograph and placed it on the evidence monitor. The screen flickered once before the image appeared overhead. Marcus Reed at a gas station convenience counter. Timestamp, 9:14 p.m. Same hour prosecutors claimed he was across town committing murder. A ripple moved through the courtroom again. Marcus stared upward at the screen so hard his eyes watered. His public defender covered her mouth with one hand. Richard spoke immediately. Too quickly. That image was reviewed already. The timestamp could not be verified. Actually, I said, it was verified. I placed another document beneath the monitor camera. Server authentication records from the gas station chain. Corporate seal. Verified. Location data. Verified internal clock synchronization. Verified receipt logs. Richard's pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the table. Tiny sound. But every head turned toward it. He grabbed it too late. This evidence was never disclosed to the defense, Judge Whitmore said. Her voice had gone dangerously calm. Richard rubbed one hand across his forehead. I never saw those records. That answer changed the room again. Because now he had admitted the records existed. Even he realized it a second too late. I watched the understanding hit him. Slow. Heavy. The gallery doors opened quietly and another reporter entered, carrying a camera bag still wet from the rain outside. News stations were arriving now. Fast. The county seal mounted behind the judge suddenly looked smaller than before. Smaller and fragile. Who removed the files? Judge Whitmore asked. Richard swallowed once before answering. I do not know. For the first time all morning, I believed he might be telling part of the truth. Not innocence. Never innocence. But fear had begun separating him from the machine around him. People inside corrupt systems always believed they were the architects until the system decided otherwise. Marcus shifted again at the defense table. So they knew, he asked softly. Nobody answered him immediately. His voice barely carried across the room, but it cut deeper than the shouting had. 17 years old. Sitting in county cuffs while adults debated which version of the lie they wanted to survive. Judge Whitmore looked toward him at last. Something in her face softened for half a second. Then it disappeared again beneath judicial control. I slid one final sheet from the gray envelope. Visitor entry logs from county holding. 3 names highlighted. 1 belonged to Daniel Mercer. 1 belonged to a homicide detective already under internal review. The 3rd name stopped Richard completely. He stared at it without blinking. His breathing changed again. Smaller breaths now. Faster. No, he said quietly. Not to the judge. Not to me. To himself. I looked down at the page. Assistant District Attorney Helen Pike. Richard's second in command for nearly 12 years. The woman currently overseeing evidence management downtown while he sat trapped inside this courtroom. The realization moved across his face like cold water. Somebody higher inside his own office had started cutting the ropes already. Judge Whitmore noticed it too. Mr. Holloway, she asked carefully, is there something this court should know? Richard looked toward the courtroom doors. Then toward the evidence boxes. Then finally at me. His voice came out lower than before. You do not understand who this reaches yet. The courtroom stayed silent after Richard spoke. Not ordinary silence. This one carried weight. The kind that pressed against the chest and made every small sound feel dangerous. Rainwater slid down the tall windows behind the bench. Somewhere in the hallway outside, a copier machine hummed faintly through the walls. Judge Whitmore leaned back slowly in her chair. Then help this court understand, she said. Richard did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the visitor log in front of him. Helen Pike's name sat highlighted in red across the page like a wound. I watched his fingers tighten around the edge of the table. His nails had gone pale. Richard, the judge said again, firmer now. He exhaled through his nose. Helen supervised intake review for major felony evidence. And she had direct access to sealed transfer requests. I slid another paper from the folder. Including requests bypassing defense notification. His eyes snapped toward me immediately. That one hit. The courtroom clerk stopped typing again. Marcus Reed looked between us carefully, trying to follow every word now. The exhaustion on his face had not disappeared, but something else had entered his expression. Caution. Tiny cautious hope. Dangerous thing inside a courtroom. You already knew about the bypass forms, Richard said quietly. Yes. How long? Long enough. He looked away first. Another small surrender. The gallery had grown fuller over the last 20 minutes. More reporters now. Wet umbrellas leaned against the rear wall. A cameraman adjusted focus near the back row while pretending not to. County officials hated cameras once control started. Slipping. Judge Whitmore folded both hands together. "Ms. Carter," she said, "did your investigation uncover direct evidence linking the prosecution office to evidence suppression?" "Yes." Richard shut his eyes briefly. "Only 1 second. But enough." I reached inside the gray envelope again and removed a flash drive sealed in clear plastic. Tiny object. Yet every person in the room stared at it like it weighed 50 pounds. "Recovered from county archive backup," I said. "Deleted internal correspondence." Richard opened his eyes again slowly. "That archive was scrubbed 6 months ago." "Not completely." A marshal stepped closer beside the bench. Quiet movement. Protective movement. Richard noticed that too. He was beginning to understand the room no longer belonged to him. Judge Whitmore nodded once. "Play the files." The courtroom monitor flickered alive again. Audio only. No images. Static crackled briefly through the speakers overhead. Then a woman's voice filled the courtroom. Helen Pike. Calm. Professional. "If Reed gets in front of a sympathetic jury, we lose leverage." Another voice answered. Male. Distorted slightly by background noise. Then tightened discovery access until after arraignment. Marcus froze beside the defense table. His public defender covered her mouth again. Richard stared straight ahead now. Completely motionless. The recording continued. Helen's voice again. "Holloway does not need details yet. He only needs conviction numbers." Richard's head lowered slowly after that. Not dramatic. Barely an inch. But the entire courtroom saw it. Judge Whitmore muted the audio halfway through the next sentence. The click echoed sharply in the silence afterward. "Mr. Holloway," she asked quietly, "were you aware your office was withholding exculpatory evidence?" Richard swallowed once. I could hear it from across the table. "No," he answered. "Not initially. Not initially." The room caught the wording immediately. Even Marcus noticed. "But later?" I asked. Richard rubbed both hands across his face. "Older now. Much older than when he first blocked my chair." "I knew things were being handled outside normal channels," he admitted softly. "I was told. Sensitive cases required containment." "Containment?" Judge Whitmore repeated. "Public optics. Political pressure. Conviction rates." His voice sounded hollow now. Every election year the office tightened. A reporter near the gallery whispered, "Oh my God." Nobody told her to be quiet. Because everybody understood the story had moved beyond one teenager sitting in county cuffs. This was institutional now. Structural. Years deep. Marcus looked down at the table in front of him. His fingers trembled slightly beside the chain between his wrists. 17 years old and listening to adults discuss his life like inventory numbers on a spreadsheet. I hated courtrooms most in moments like this. The polished wood. The flags. The careful language covering ugly truths underneath. Richard finally looked toward Marcus directly for the first time all morning. His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "I did not think they would bury evidence that could clear you." Marcus stared back at him without blinking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Then somebody knocked hard against the courtroom doors outside. The knock came again. Harder this time. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the doors. One of the marshals moved immediately. His hand brushed the inside of his coat as he crossed the aisle. The room had become too quiet again. Even the heating vent seemed to hum lower now. Judge Whitmore straightened in her chair. "Who is interrupting my courtroom?" she called out. The marshal opened the door only halfway. Rain and hallway noise spilled briefly into the room. Fast footsteps. Distant phones ringing. Somebody speaking too loudly outside. Then a woman's voice answered from the hall. Sharp. Controlled. Assistant District Attorney Helen Pike. Richard Holloway closed his eyes for half a second. Not relief. Worse than relief. Recognition. The marshal hesitated before stepping aside. Helen Pike entered carrying a soaked navy umbrella and a leather case pressed tightly beneath one arm. Water dripped from the edge of her coat onto the polished courtroom floor. She did not look toward the gallery first. She looked directly at Richard. That told me everything. Helen was in her early 50s. Silver streaks at the edge of dark hair. Expensive suit despite the storm outside. Calm face. But her breathing gave her away. Too fast. She had climbed the courthouse stairs in a hurry. The courtroom reporters immediately raised phones again. One cameraman near the back quietly adjusted focus toward her. Helen noticed the cameras and slowed her pace. Professional instinct. Your Honor, she said, this hearing needs to stop immediately. Judge Whitmore did not blink. On what grounds? Helen set the leather case onto the prosecution table beside Richard. Federal overreach. Improper evidence seizure. Breach of prosecutorial confidentiality. Strong words. But her voice carried strain underneath now. She looked toward me briefly. Just one glance. Cold enough to cut. Special Counsel Carter obtained internal materials outside authorized procedure. Incorrect, I answered. Every document was subpoenaed. Helen ignored me. That was deliberate too. Some people believed refusing to acknowledge you was still a form of power. Richard remained seated beside her. He had not greeted her once. That mattered. Helen finally looked down at him. Why did you cooperate? She asked quietly. Richard laughed once under his breath. Dry sound. Empty sound. You already know why. Her jaw tightened slightly. Tiny movement. But I caught it. Judge Whitmore extended one hand toward the leather case. What is inside? Helen hesitated. Only a second. Internal review files. Concerning the Reed prosecution. Marcus lifted his head sharply again. Hope and fear mixed together now across his face in painful ways. Young people still believed truth arrived clean once adults finally admitted it. Courtrooms taught otherwise. Helen opened the leather case slowly. Stacks of folders appeared inside. Red labels. Confidential markings. Transfer records. I recognized several case numbers immediately. More than Reed. Much more. The gallery reacted too. One reporter whispered, there are dozens. Helen removed a single folder and placed it carefully onto the table. There were procedural failures, she admitted. But not criminal intent. Richard looked at her for the first time. Since she entered. Still protecting them? He asked. Her eyes flashed toward him sharply. Be careful. The warning landed heavy between them. Not anger. Fear. Real fear. Judge Whitmore noticed it too. Ms. Pike, the judge said carefully, who exactly are you protecting? Helen did not answer right away. Rain hammered louder against the courthouse windows now. Thunder rolled faintly somewhere over downtown. The fluorescent lights flickered once overhead. Tiny flicker. But enough to pull every eye upward for a moment. Helen looked toward the courtroom doors behind her. Then toward the cameras. Then finally at Marcus Reed sitting alone in county cuffs. Something changed in her face after that. Very small. Human. This office built careers on conviction numbers, she said quietly. People stopped asking where the evidence came from. Nobody moved. Nobody even whispered now. Richard lowered his eyes toward the prosecution table. The confidence that once filled the room around him was completely gone. Helen placed one hand flat against the folder in front of her. Her nails trembled slightly against the cardboard edge. "But this case was never supposed to reach trial," she said. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slowly. "Explain that statement." Helen looked directly at me this time. Then at the federal marshals beside the wall. Her voice dropped lower. "Because somebody else was supposed to confess first." The words hung in the courtroom like smoke after a fire. Somebody else was supposed to confess first. Nobody shifted. Nobody coughed. Even the reporters stopped moving their phones for a second. Rain slammed against the windows in heavy waves now. Thunder rolled again somewhere above downtown. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slowly. "Ms. Pike," she said, "clarify your statement immediately." Helen Pike kept one hand on the folder in front of her. Her knuckles had gone pale. Richard Holloway watched her carefully now. Not like a colleague anymore. Like a man realizing the floor beneath him had already cracked open. 3 days ago, Helen said quietly, we received notice that an inmate at Fulton County Correctional intended to come forward. Marcus Reed frowned. Immediately. Who? Helen looked toward him for the first time since entering the room. A man named Darnell Hayes. Marcus froze. His public defender whispered the name under her breath as if checking whether she remembered it correctly. I did. Darnell Hayes. 26 years old. Prior robbery charges. Plea bargain history. Small-time offender pushed through the system too many times to count. Helen opened the folder and removed a transcript packet. Hayes requested protective transfer before giving a formal statement, she continued. He claimed he had information regarding the Reed homicide. Judge Whitmore extended her hand. Give that to the court. Helen hesitated again. Tiny pause. But enough. Richard noticed it too. Helen, he said carefully, what did he say? She handed the transcript forward without answering him directly. The pages made a dry sound against the polished wood bench. Judge Whitmore began reading silently. Her expression changed almost immediately. Not shock. Worse. Recognition. This statement claims Marcus Reed was not present at the scene, the judge said. Marcus stared at her like he had stopped understanding language for a second. What? His voice cracked slightly. 17 years old again beneath all the courtroom weight. Helen kept speaking quietly. Hayes claimed the shooting involved 2 different suspects connected to a narcotics operation under separate investigation. And your office buried that? Marcus's defender asked sharply. Helen looked down. The statement was never finalized. Why? Silence again. Heavy silence. Richard slowly pushed back from the prosecution table. His chair wheels squealed softly against the floor. Because somebody blocked the transfer request, he said. Helen did not deny it. That answer alone hit the room harder than shouting could have. One of the reporters near the back whispered into her phone immediately. Another hurried toward the hallway doors. News was escaping faster now. Impossible to stop. Judge Whitmore flipped another page inside the transcript packet. This witness claimed investigators pressured him to stay silent. Helen nodded once. He said detectives promised reduced charges if he waited until after the Reed conviction. Marcus lowered his head slowly into his hands again. The chain between his cuffs rattled softly against the table edge. I watched his shoulders tighten beneath the oversized brown suit. Not anger. Not yet. The sound a person makes internally when reality finally becomes too large to hold together cleanly. Richard looked toward me suddenly. Did your office verify Hayes? Partially. Where is he now? I did not answer immediately. Because that part mattered. Judge Whitmore looked up from the papers sharply. "Ms. Carter?" The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead again. One of them flickered twice near the jury box before stabilizing. Tiny electrical hum filled the pause. "Mr. Hayes disappeared 48 hours ago," I said. The courtroom reacted all at once this time. Gasps. Whispering. Somebody near the rear benches actually stood halfway up before sitting back down again. Helen closed her eyes briefly. Richard cursed under his breath. Marcus just stared at the table in front of him. Completely still now. Judge Whitmore struck the bench once with her gavel. Sharp crack through the room. "Order." The noise died slowly afterward. Like waves settling after impact. "Was local law enforcement notified?" the judge asked. "Yes." "And?" I looked toward the courthouse windows. Rainwater blurred the city skyline beyond the glass into gray streaks. "The missing persons report was reassigned twice within 12 hours, I answered. Richard leaned back in his chair slowly after hearing that. He looked less like a prosecutor now and more like a man finally seeing the size of the machine he once served willingly. Helen folded both hands together tightly in front of her. "We thought delaying the confession would protect the office," she admitted quietly. Marcus looked up at her then. His voice came out low and raw. "Protect it from what?" Nobody answered him immediately. Then a marshal near the courtroom doors touched the earpiece beside his collar. The marshal pressed 2 fingers against the earpiece beside his collar and turned slightly away from the courtroom. His face changed almost immediately. Not panic. Controlled. Urgency. Judge Whitmore noticed it before anyone else. "What is it?" she asked. The marshal stepped closer to the bench. He lowered his voice, but in the silence everybody still heard enough. "They located Darnell Hayes." Marcus Reed lifted his head so quickly the chain between his cuffs snapped against the table edge. Helen Pike closed her eyes again briefly. Richard Holloway sat completely motionless beside her. "Alive?" I asked. The marshal hesitated 1 second too long. "Yes." The entire courtroom released breath at once. Tiny sounds everywhere. Chairs shifting. Somebody whispering "thank God" near the gallery. Rain continued hammering against the courthouse windows, but the room itself felt different now. Tighter. Sharper. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. "Where was he found?" "Bus terminal on the south side. Federal agents intercepted him less than 20 minutes ago." Marcus stared at the marshal like he was afraid the answer might disappear if he blinked. "Did he talk?" The marshal looked toward me first. I already knew what that meant. "He asked for legal protection before giving a formal statement," the marshal answered carefully. Helen lowered her gaze toward the prosecution table. Richard finally spoke again. Quiet voice now. "Stripped down. He is terrified." Nobody argued with him. Because fear had been sitting in this courtroom all morning wearing different faces. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses slowly again. "This hearing is now under sealed federal review until further notice." One reporter near the back immediately objected. "Your Honor, the public has a right to, the public will survive 1 hour without updates," the judge said sharply. Silence again. The reporter sat back down. I opened another section of my folder and removed a slim manila file with faded corners. The paper smelled old. Storage dust and dry cardboard. Richard recognized it instantly. "No," he muttered under his breath. Helen looked toward the file too. Fear crossed her face this time openly. "What is that?" Judge Whitmore asked. I laid the file carefully onto the table. "The first complaint." Marcus frowned. "Complaint about what?" I looked toward him briefly. "About your arresting detective." Richard rubbed one hand across his mouth slowly. Outside the courtroom, thunder cracked louder than before. The lights dimmed for half a second and recovered again. Tiny flicker across polished wood and wet umbrellas near the back wall. I opened the file. Internal Affairs Complaint. 7 years old. Detective Leon Barter. Allegation: witness intimidation and evidence manipulation in a narcotics homicide case. Final result: dismissed due to insufficient corroboration. Judge Whitmore read the page silently. Barter was involved in the Reed investigation. Lead detective, I answered. Marcus leaned back slowly in his chair like the room had tilted beneath him. He told everybody I matched the witness description. You did, I said carefully. Partially. Marcus frowned harder. What does that mean? Helen answered before I could. The original witness described 2 suspects. Marcus stared at her. 2. She nodded once. Barely. 1 black teenager. 1 older white male. The courtroom reacted immediately. Whispering broke loose again across the gallery benches. Richard shut his eyes tightly for a second. He already understood where this was heading. Marcus did not yet. Not fully. Then why was I the only one arrested? Marcus asked. Nobody answered immediately. That silence became its own answer. I watched his face slowly change as realization moved through him piece by piece. The oversized brown suit. The county cuffs. The months sitting and holding while somebody else vanished into paperwork and protected files. Judge Whitmore looked toward Helen sharply. Was the second suspect ever identified? Helen swallowed once before speaking. Not officially. Unofficially. Helen looked toward Richard. He did not help her now. Not anymore. There were concerns about political consequences, she admitted quietly. Marcus laughed once under his breath. Bitter sound. Young sound. Political, he repeated. I was 17. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead again. One reporter slowly lowered her phone after hearing that. Even she looked sick now. I closed the old complaint file carefully. The cardboard edges felt soft from years inside storage. Boxes nobody wanted reopened. Judge Whitmore folded both hands together on the bench. Ms. Carter, she asked quietly, who was the second suspect? I looked toward the courtroom doors. Then back at the judge. A city councilman's son, I answered. The courtroom did not explode after I said it. It collapsed inward instead. Quietly. Slowly. Like a building realizing its foundation had been rotten for years. A city councilman's son. The word settled over the room heavier than any accusation before them. Marcus Reed stared at me without blinking. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out at first. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses again and placed them carefully beside the bench. Name him, she said. Rain lashed against the courthouse windows hard enough now to blur the skyline completely. I looked down at the folder in front of me. Thick paper. Coffee stains near one corner from some exhausted investigator years earlier. Evan Delaney, I answered. Somebody in the gallery whispered the name immediately. Another person muttered, Councilman Robert Delaney. Helen Pike lowered her eyes toward the table. That was answer enough. Marcus leaned back slowly in his chair. Delaney, he repeated under his breath. Like he was testing whether the word felt real. Richard Holloway rubbed one hand against his forehead again. His expensive cufflinks had lost their shine under the fluorescent lights. The witness originally identified Delaney's vehicle near the scene, he admitted quietly. Judge Whitmore turned toward him sharply. You knew. Richard's throat tightened visibly before he answered. I knew his name surfaced. But not enough to charge him. Richard did not speak. Outside the courtroom, thunder rolled low across the city again. The sound lingered longer this time. Helen finally looked toward Marcus directly. The office was told there was not enough physical evidence connecting him. Marcus laughed once. Bitter again. Smaller this time. But there was enough for me. Nobody answered him. Because there was no answer clean enough to survive the room anymore. One of the reporters near the back slowly lowered her phone entirely now. She was not chasing headlines anymore. She was listening. Different thing. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. Ms. Pike, who gave the order to narrow the investigation exclusively toward Mr. Reed? Helen's breathing changed slightly. I noticed it immediately. Faster now. Shallow. The recommendation came from Detective Barter, she said. And who approved it? Silence. Richard stared down at the prosecution table. Helen looked toward the courthouse doors again. Same nervous glance as before. Helen, the judge said firmly. Answer the question. Helen swallowed once. Councilman Delaney requested a private meeting with senior staff 48 hours after the homicide. Marcus closed his eyes tightly. His shoulders shook once beneath the oversized suit jacket. Not crying. Just the body reacting when truth finally lands somewhere too deep. I remembered being 17. Remembered adults discussing futures over conference tables while pretending the human being involved was not sitting 3 feet away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. One bulb near the rear benches flickered again. Nobody looked up this time. The courtroom had stopped caring about small failures. Who attended the meeting? I asked quietly. Helen hesitated. Richard answered instead. I did. Every eye in the room moved toward him again. He did not look up. And? Judge Whitmore pressed. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. The councilman insisted his son was unstable after the incident. Marcus looked at him sharply. Incident? Richard finally raised his eyes toward Marcus for the first time since the confession recordings. Shame sat there now. Real shame. That is the word they used, he said quietly. Marcus shook his head once in disbelief. The chain between his cuffs rattled softly against the chair arm. Tiny sound. Human sound. So they traded me for him. Nobody corrected him. Helen's hand trembled slightly beside the folders on the table. She pressed her fingers flat to stop it. The plan was temporary, she whispered. Temporary pressure until Delaney entered treatment. Marcus stared at her like he no longer recognized the language adults spoke. Judge Whitmore's voice hardened. You held a teenager in county detention as political cover. Helen shut her eyes. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear entirely into the courtroom floor. Rainwater streamed down the windows in silver sheets behind them. Somewhere downstairs, courthouse security radios crackled faintly through the walls. I closed the Delaney file carefully. The cardboard edges felt softer now from years of handling and hiding. Marcus looked toward me slowly. His voice came out lower than before. Did they ever plan on letting me go? Nobody answered him immediately. Then Richard Holloway finally spoke without lifting his head. Not after the polls improved. The courtroom stayed frozen after Richard spoke. Not after the polls improved. The sentence hung in the air like something poisonous nobody wanted to breathe too deeply. Marcus Reed lowered his eyes slowly toward the table in front of him. The chain between his wrists rested against the wood now without moving. For the first time all morning, he looked completely still. Judge Whitmore sat rigid behind the bench. Her face had gone pale beneath the fluorescent lights. You kept an innocent teenager in custody for political optics, she said quietly. Richard did not defend himself this time. Helen Pike looked toward the rain-streaked windows. Somewhere outside, a siren passed through downtown traffic. Faint. Distant. The city was still moving while this courtroom slowly came apart. One of the reporters near the gallery wiped her eyes quickly and pretended she had not. Marcus finally looked up again. His voice sounded smaller now. Younger. My mother missed work every week coming here. Nobody answered. She sold her car to pay my lawyer before the public defender. His breathing caught slightly. They kept telling her the system works. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Helen pressed both hands flat against the table. I felt the room shift again then. Not toward anger. Toward shame. Different thing entirely. Judge Whitmore looked toward the bailiff near the wall. Remove Mr. Reed's restraints. The courtroom reacted immediately. Marcus blinked once like he had not heard correctly. The bailiff hesitated only a second before stepping forward. With the keys. Tiny metal clicks filled the silence. The cuffs opened around Marcus's wrists. Red marks remained where the steel had pressed his skin for months. He rubbed one wrist slowly after the chains came away. Careful movement. Like freedom itself felt unfamiliar now. Richard watched the cuffs leave the table. His face tightened sharply for a moment. Your Honor, he said quietly, there are procedures, do not speak to me about procedures today. Her voice cut straight through him. Richard lowered his eyes again. Marcus sat there rubbing his wrists while the courtroom watched him differently now. Not as a defendant anymore. As a boy somebody had cornered inside paperwork and sealed evidence boxes because powerful adults found him convenient. Helen finally looked directly at him again. Marcus, she said softly, I am sorry. He stared at her for several seconds. Long enough that even the reporters stopped writing again. You still went home every night, he answered. Nobody in the room escaped that sentence cleanly. The heating vents hummed overhead. Rainwater continued sliding down the courthouse windows in silver streaks. One marshal near the back shifted his weight quietly against the wall. Human sounds had become louder all morning because nobody trusted silence anymore. I opened the final section of my folder. Thin stack. Personal records. School attendance. Community evaluations. Marcus noticed immediately. What is that? He asked. Everything they ignored, I answered. Judge Whitmore accepted the papers carefully. Honor roll certificates. Part-time employment records. Volunteer hours from a church food pantry on the west side. Recommendation letters from teachers. Tiny pieces of a life nobody inside the prosecution office had bothered protecting. Richard stared at the documents without touching them. He did not fit the narrative they needed, I said quietly. Helen shut her eyes again. Marcus looked down at his own school photograph clipped inside the file. 17 years old. Nervous smile. Football jersey slightly crooked at the collar. Just a kid before the machinery found him useful. My mother kept telling me not to hate everybody, Marcus said softly. She said somebody honest would eventually look at the truth. His eyes lifted toward me then. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly across tears he still refused to let fall. I stopped believing her after month 4. Nobody spoke after that. Even Judge Whitmore seemed unable to find words quickly enough. The room had become too human now for courtroom language to cover comfortably. Richard Holloway looked toward Marcus one last time. Your mother was right, he said quietly. Marcus held his gaze without blinking. Then why did it take you this long? Richard opened his mouth once. Then stopped. Because he finally understood there was no answer left worth defending. A marshal near the courtroom doors suddenly stepped forward holding a vibrating phone. The marshal holding the vibrating phone stepped closer to Judge Whitmore instead of answering it immediately. His expression had changed again, this time sharper, almost urgent. The entire courtroom watched him cross the floor. Even the sound of his shoes felt amplified against the polished wood. He leaned toward the bench and spoke in a low voice. Your Honor, We just received an update from federal custody transfer. Judge Whitmore did not move. Speak clearly. The marshal swallowed once. Darnell Hayes has given a full recorded statement. The words landed differently than everything before it. Not chaos. Not shock. Something more controlled. Like the final piece of a structure snapping into place. Helen Pike closed her eyes immediately. Richard Holloway leaned back slowly in his chair, as if the air itself had become heavier. Marcus Reed looked up without blinking. What did he say? Marcus asked quietly. The marshal hesitated only a fraction before continuing. He confirmed he was present at the scene but stated Marcus Reed was not involved in the shooting. A soft sound moved through the gallery. Not loud. Just disbelief trying to form itself into breath. Judge Whitmore raised one hand slightly. Continue. The marshal nodded. He identified the second individual as Evan Delaney. The name struck the room like a dropped weight. Marcus did not move. For a moment, it looked like he had stopped understanding language again. Helen Pike turned her head slowly toward Richard. Richard did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the table, but his hands had stopped moving completely. The marshal continued, voice lower now. Hayes stated he was instructed to relocate after the incident and was promised protection through unofficial channels tied to the councilman's office. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Even the rain outside seemed to pause for a fraction of a second before continuing again against the glass. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses once more and set them down with deliberate care. So it is confirmed, she said quietly. The original suspect list was altered after the fact. Nobody contradicted her. Marcus slowly turned his head toward me. His voice was barely audible. So I was never supposed to be there. I met his eyes directly. No, I said. Helen finally spoke again, but her voice had lost almost all control. I tried to stop this when I saw the first suppression notice. But by then it had already moved through too many hands. Richard let out a single breath that sounded more like surrender than anything else he had done all morning. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly. Ms. Carter, is there anything left undisclosed? I looked down at the final page inside my folder. One sheet remained. Not evidence. Not testimony. Something else. Yes, I said. I placed it on the bench. A signed immunity request from Darnell Hayes, time-stamped 3 hours before the hearing began. Marcus stared at it without speaking. His hands trembled slightly for the first time since the cuffs were removed. Judge Whitmore read it carefully. Her expression softened just a fraction. He is willing to testify in open court, she asked. I nodded. Helen covered her mouth briefly with one hand. Richard did not move at all now. The system had stopped defending itself. Marcus leaned forward slowly, as if afraid the document might disappear if he moved too quickly. So what happens now? He asked. Nobody answered immediately. Judge Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke quietly, almost carefully. Now the record is corrected. Marcus closed his eyes. Not in relief. Not yet. Something closer to exhaustion finally allowed to exist without punishment. Outside the courthouse, sirens began to gather in the distance. Not emergency. Movement. Procedure catching up to truth. Helen Pike gathered her folders with slow hands. Richard remained seated, staring at nothing in particular. The marshal at the doors lowered his phone completely. The courtroom no longer belonged to any one person. It belonged to everything that had finally been exposed. Judge Whitmore looked toward me one last time. Ms. Carter, she said, this court acknowledges your findings. I did not respond immediately. I looked at Marcus instead. For the first time, he was not being measured by a case number, a conviction rate, or a political calculation. Just a person sitting in a room that had finally stopped lying. "It is not finished yet," I said quietly. The courtroom did not react immediately after my words. It simply held its breath. Like a living thing waiting to see whether pain would continue or finally stop. Marcus Reed remained seated, staring forward now without blinking. His face had gone completely still, but his hands kept trembling slightly on the edge of the table. Judge Whitmore looked at me carefully. "What do you mean by not finished?" she asked. The rain outside the courthouse softened for the first time all morning, turning from heavy impact into a steady wash against the glass. I looked down at the final empty space inside my folder. "Because correction is not the same as repair," I said. Richard Holloway shifted slightly in his chair. For the first time since the hearing began, he did not look like someone defending a position. He looked like someone trying to understand how far he had already fallen without noticing. Helen Pike gathered her remaining files slowly, but she did not leave. Nobody had left. Even the reporters stayed seated now, phones lowered. Something about the moment made movement feel wrong. Marcus finally spoke again, voice low and careful. "So what happens to me now?" The question was simple, but it carried everything he had not been allowed to ask for years. Judge Whitmore did not answer. Immediately. She looked toward the federal marshals, then toward me. Then she spoke with measured calm. "The record will be submitted for immediate judicial review. All prior findings in this case are suspended pending full re-examination." Marcus exhaled slowly. Not relief yet. Just space. For the first time in years, space. Helen Pike placed her hands flat on the table. "There will be internal accountability hearings," she said quietly, almost to herself. Richard finally looked at her. "You knew it was this deep," he said. It was not an accusation anymore. It was exhaustion trying to form itself into language. Helen did not deny it. That silence confirmed more than words ever could. I closed my folder slowly. The sound of paper against paper felt louder than anything else in the room. Judge Whitmore leaned back slightly in her chair. "Ms. Carter," she said, "you initiated this review with federal authority. What outcome were you authorized to pursue?" I looked at Marcus before answering. He met my eyes this time without fear, only waiting. "Truth," I said simply. The word felt small compared to everything it had uncovered. But it held the weight of every document, every recording, every sealed file that had been hidden behind procedural language. Marcus nodded once, very slowly. As if something inside him had finally stopped fighting for air. Richard Holloway sat back completely now. His hands were no longer on the table. They rested in his lap, still. "So this is the end of it," he said quietly. I shook my head once. "No," I answered. "This is where it becomes visible." The courtroom stayed silent after that. Even the rain seemed distant now, as if the storm had moved somewhere else entirely. Judge Whitmore reached for her gavel, but did not strike it. She simply held it for a moment, then placed it back down. "Then this court will adjourn until federal review convenes," she said. Chairs shifted slowly. People began to stand, but no one left quickly. There was no rush anymore. Marcus remained seated for a few seconds longer. Then he looked toward the empty space where the restraints had been earlier. He touched his wrists once, lightly, as if confirming. Something real had happened. Helen Pike walked toward the side exit without looking back. Richard followed more slowly, stopping once near the doorway. He did not turn around, but his voice carried back into the room. "I thought I was protecting the system," he said. No one answered him. The doors closed behind him quietly. The courtroom remained. Not empty. Not resolved. Just changed. Marcus finally stood. Slowly. Carefully. He looked at me one last time. "What do I do now?" he asked. I met his gaze and answered without hesitation. Now you learn what it means to live outside their story. He nodded once. Then he walked forward, past the bench, past the table, toward the open doors where light from the hallway waited. The courtroom stayed behind him, silent and still, as if it was only now beginning to understand everything it had held.